I thought someone broke into my house, but the footage showed something worse. It started with a notification I almost ignored, one of those delayed alerts from my doorbell camera that usually meant a package got dropped off or a neighbor walked too close to my porch. Nothing urgent, nothing worth stopping what I was doing for, and I remember it was late, a little past midnight. I was sitting on my couch with the TV on low, lights dimmed, the kind of quiet that feels normal when you live alone long enough. And I only checked it because I had this habit of clearing notifications before going to bed, just small routines that make you feel like everything's under control. So I opened the app and tapped the clip without really thinking about it, expecting to see nothing, or maybe a stray cat crossing the porch, but instead I saw a man walking straight toward my front door, and at first nothing about it seemed immediately wrong. He wasn't running, he wasn't trying to hide his face, he just walked up like he belonged there, like he'd done it before, and I remember leaning forward a little, turning the volume up even though there was no audio, just to focus on it more, and then I saw him step right up to the door, pause for less than a second, and then the door opened, and he walked inside. I sat there for a few seconds after the clip ended, waiting for it to continue, like maybe there was another angle or another recording that would explain what I just saw, but that was it, just a clean entry, no hesitation, no attempt to force anything, just in and gone, and my first thought wasn't fear, it was confusion, because I had been home that entire night, I hadn't gone out, I hadn't heard anything, no footsteps, no door opening, nothing that would even suggest someone had come inside. And I remember actually rewinding the clip immediately, watching it again, slower this time, paying attention to every frame, trying to catch something I missed. Maybe the door didn't actually open, maybe it was just the angle, maybe it looked like he went inside but he didn't, but no, the door definitely opened, and he definitely crossed the threshold. I checked the timestamp next, 2:13 a.m., and that made me pause, because I was awake at that time. I knew I had been on my couch scrolling through my phone, the TV still on, and there's no way someone could have opened my front door without me noticing, not with how quiet the house gets at night, not with how close the living room is to the front entrance, and I even looked over at the door from where I was sitting, like I expected it to somehow explain itself. Like maybe it had been unlocked and I just forgot, but I'm the kind of person who checks the lock twice before bed, sometimes 3 times, just to be sure. It's one of those habits you pick up when you live alone, especially in a suburban area where everything feels safe until you start thinking about how easy it would be for someone to test that. I told myself it had to be a glitch, that made the most sense. Cameras mess up, timestamps get weird, sometimes the app sends old clips like they just happened, and I held on to that explanation because it was the only one that didn't immediately put me in danger, and I remember actually saying it out loud, like that would make it more real, just a glitch. Nothing else, but something about the way he moved didn't feel like a glitch. It felt too smooth, too intentional, and there was one detail I couldn't ignore. The porch light turned on right before he stepped into frame, and that light only turns on when motion is detected in real time, not on old footage, not on delayed clips. It reacts instantly, and seeing that made something in my chest tighten just a little, not enough to panic, but enough to make me sit up straighter and replay the clip again. The more I watched it, the more I noticed small things that didn't sit right. The way he didn't look at the camera, not even once. Most people glance at it, even if they don't realize they're doing it, but he didn't. His head stayed forward the entire time, like he already knew where everything was, like he didn't need to check, and the way he paused at the door wasn't like someone deciding whether to knock or leave. It was more like someone waiting for something to line up, like a timing thing, and then the door just opened. And I couldn't tell if he opened it or if it opened on its own. The angle didn't show his hands clearly, and that detail started to bother me more than anything else. I stood up and walked to the front door, not quickly, not like I was expecting to see someone on the other side, just slow, careful steps, like I didn't want to make the situation more real than it already was. And when I got there, the deadbolt was locked, the chain was still on, exactly how I left it, and I remember touching the lock, just to feel it, like that would confirm something. Like it would ground me in what I knew had to be true, and for a moment, that worked, because if the door was still locked from the inside, then no one could have come in, at least not through there, and that brought me back to the glitch explanation, stronger this time, more convincing, and I almost stopped thinking about it right there, almost went back to the couch and let it go, but something kept pulling me back to the clip, something about it didn't want to be ignored, like it was missing a piece I hadn't found yet. And I knew if I didn't figure it out, it was going to sit in the back of my mind all night. I went back to my phone and played the footage again, this time frame by frame, slowing it down to the point where each movement felt deliberate, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't caught before. Right as he stepped up to the door, the handle didn't move the way it should if someone was turning it from the outside. There was no visible twist, no shift in his shoulder, nothing that suggested he was applying any force at all. And yet the door still opened, just slightly at first, then wider, like it had already been unlatched, like it didn't need to be unlocked from the outside at all. And that's when the first real thought hit me, not fully formed, not something I wanted to accept, just a quiet possibility that slipped in before I could stop it. If he didn't open the door from the outside, then maybe it had already been opened from the inside, and I remember just staring at the screen for a few seconds after that, not moving, not blinking much, just letting that idea sit there without fully acknowledging it, because the second I did, the entire situation would change, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I kept replaying that last part, the moment where the door opened without him touching it, and every time I watched it, I tried to convince myself I was just missing something. Maybe his hand was out of frame, maybe the lighting made it look smoother than it actually was, but the more I slowed it down, the worse it looked, because there was no hesitation in the door at all, no resistance, it just moved like it was already unlocked and waiting, and I felt that same tight feeling in my chest. Again, only this time it stayed a little longer, and I caught myself looking around my living room without really meaning to, like I expected something to be different now that I had noticed it, like the house itself might have shifted without me realizing. I told myself I was overthinking it, that was still the most reasonable explanation. Cameras mess up, people misread footage all the time, and I had already been up late, already tired, already in that state where your brain starts connecting things that are not really there, so I tried to ground myself in what I could actually confirm. I was home that entire night. I did not hear the door open, I did not hear footsteps. Nothing triggered any of my other devices, and most importantly, the door was still locked from the inside when I checked it, so whatever that clip showed, it did not line up with reality, and that meant the clip had to be wrong, not my house, not my memory, just the camera. I opened the app again and checked the rest of the timeline, scrolling back through earlier clips from that night, looking for anything that might support that explanation, anything that showed the system glitching or mislabeling events. But everything else looked normal. A car driving past around 10:47 p.m., a neighbor walking their dog at 11:12, then nothing until that 2:13 a.m. clip, and after that, nothing again until morning, no second recording of him leaving, no motion detected, nothing that would suggest someone exited the house the same way they came in, and that absence started to feel heavier the longer I stared at it, because if the system was working fine before and after, then why would it only mess up at that exact moment? I clicked into the settings and checked the motion sensitivity, the activity zones, all the small technical details I barely understood but trusted enough to assume they were doing their job, and everything was set the way it had always been, nothing changed, nothing that would explain a missed recording, and that made me sit back again, this time slower, like I was trying not to disturb something I could not see yet. And I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing. I tried to think of another explanation, something simple, something that would close the gap between what I saw and what I knew, and the first thing that came to mind was the spare key I kept in my kitchen drawer, a backup I rarely used but always knew was there, and I wondered if maybe someone I knew had access to it, maybe a friend who had been over before, maybe someone who had borrowed it and forgot to tell me they were stopping by. And that idea felt better immediately, because it turned the situation into something social, something explainable, not something hidden, and I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, thinking about who it could be, who would even come over at that hour without calling first, and the list felt shorter the more I thought about it, because the truth was, no one had a reason to do that, not at 2:13 in the morning, not without telling me, and that thought lingered just long enough to make the explanation feel thin. I still made a call anyway, starting with the most likely person, my friend Jason, who had stayed over a few times and knew where I kept things, and when he answered, I kept my tone casual, like I was asking about something small, something that did not matter much, just to avoid making it sound as strange as it felt, and I asked him if he had come by my place the night before, maybe to grab something or check on something. And there was a pause on the other end before he laughed, a short, confused laugh, and said no, he had been home all night, and then he asked why, and I told him it was nothing, just a weird camera notification, probably a glitch, and he said that sounded about right and we hung up, and that should have been enough to settle it, that should have been the end of it, but it was not. I went back to the clip again, this time focusing only on the door itself, ignoring the man completely, watching the frame where the door moved, trying to see if there was any sign of it being forced from the outside, any shift in the hinges, any bounce that would suggest pressure, but there was none. The movement was too clean, too smooth, like the door was already slightly open before he even reached it, and that detail stayed with me, repeating in my head in a way that felt different from the earlier confusion, because now it was not just about what I saw, it was about what it implied, and I found myself looking back toward the front door again, even though I had already checked it, like I expected it to somehow look different now, like it might not be as secure as it felt a few minutes ago. I stood there for a moment, listening, not for anything specific, just listening in general, the way you do when you are trying to confirm that everything is still normal, and the house sounded exactly the same as it always did at that hour, the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of something in the walls, the kind of background noise you stop noticing after a while, and for a second, that helped. It pulled me back toward the idea that nothing had actually changed, that the clip was the only strange thing in an otherwise normal night, and I almost let myself believe that fully, almost let the tension drop, until I remembered something small, something I had not paid attention to earlier, the porch light turning on right before he appeared, and I knew that light only responded to real movement, in real time, not to old recordings, not to delayed uploads. And that meant whatever triggered it had to have been physically there at that exact moment, not earlier, not later, but right then, at 2:13 in the morning, and as soon as that thought settled in, the house did not feel quite as quiet as it had a second ago. It felt like I was listening for something I had not been aware of before, something subtle, something easy to miss, and I realized I was no longer trying to prove the footage was wrong, I was trying to figure out how it could be right. I did not want to admit it out loud, but at that point I had already stopped trusting the camera, and I had started paying attention to the house instead, the small details I would normally ignore, the kind of things that only stand out when you are actively looking for them, and the first thing I noticed was how the air felt different, not colder exactly, just uneven. Like one part of the house was holding on to a different temperature than the rest, and I stood there in the middle of the living room trying to figure out if that was new or if I had just never paid attention before, and I told myself it was nothing, probably the air conditioning cycling the way it always did at night, but even that explanation felt like something I was forcing into place rather than something that naturally fit. I decided to check the rest of the house, not because I thought I would find anything, but because standing still felt worse, so I started with the kitchen, flipping on the light even though I did not need it, just to make the space feel more defined, and everything looked normal at first. The counters were clear, the sink was empty, the drawer where I kept the spare key was still closed, and I actually opened it just to confirm. And the key was there exactly where I left it, which should have made me feel better, but it did the opposite, because it removed one of the last explanations I had, and now I was left with fewer ways to explain what I had seen. I closed the drawer slowly and stood there for a second, listening again, and that was when I noticed something subtle, something I would have missed if I was not already on edge, a faint shift in sound coming from somewhere deeper in the house, not a clear noise, not something I could immediately identify, just a slight change in the background hum, like something had interrupted it for a second and then stopped, and I told myself it was probably the refrigerator or the vents or even just the house settling, because older homes make small sounds all the time, especially at night, but the timing of it felt too close to everything else, too connected, and that was enough to make me move a little slower as I walked down the hallway. I kept the lights on as I went, flipping each switch before stepping forward, not wanting to walk into any dark space without seeing it first, and I checked the bathroom, then the guest room, both empty, both exactly how I left them, and each room I cleared should have made the situation feel more under control, but it did not, it just narrowed things down, and I became more aware of the spaces I had not checked yet, especially the ones that were easier to overlook. When I reached my bedroom, I paused at the doorway, not because I expected to see someone inside, but because I realized I had not been in there since earlier that evening, and for the first time, I could not immediately picture exactly how everything was arranged, and that small gap in certainty was enough to make me hesitate before stepping in. I turned on the light and scanned the room. The bed was made the same way, the dresser was untouched, nothing obviously out of place, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, but then I noticed the closet door, not fully open, not fully closed, just slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two, and I tried to remember if I had left it like that, and I could not, and that bothered me more than it should have. Because it was such a small detail, something that could easily happen without me noticing, but in that moment it felt like a question I could not answer, and that made it harder to ignore. I stepped closer and pushed the door open the rest of the way, slowly, watching the gap as it widened, half expecting something to move or shift inside, but nothing did. The closet looked exactly the way it always did, clothes hanging in place, nothing disturbed, and I stood there for a second longer just to be sure before stepping back, telling myself again that I was overreacting, that all of this was just my brain trying to connect things that were not connected, and that the simplest explanation was still the right one, even if I had not fully proven it yet. I moved back into the hallway and looked toward the far end of the house, where the pull-down ladder to the attic was located, and I had not thought about the attic at all until that moment, not once since I started checking the rooms, because it was not part of my daily routine, not a space I used or even considered most of the time, and that made it easy to forget, but now that it was in my mind, it felt like something I should not ignore, even if I did not have a clear reason to check it. And I told myself I was just being thorough, just making sure every part of the house matched what I expected, nothing more than that. As I took a few steps toward it, I noticed something else, something even smaller than the closet door. The hallway light near the attic entrance was already on, and I stopped for a second, trying to remember if I had turned it on earlier when I started checking the house, and I could not be sure, and that uncertainty felt heavier than it should have, because it was stacking on top of everything else. All these small details that individually meant nothing but together started to form a pattern I could not fully see yet. I stood there listening again, focusing on that same background noise I had noticed before, trying to isolate it, trying to figure out where it was coming from, and for a moment there was nothing, just the same quiet hum, steady and normal, and then it shifted again, just slightly, like something above me had adjusted its weight and then gone still, and this time I knew I had not imagined it, because I was waiting for it, and that made it real in a way the footage had not been, because this was happening now, in the same space I was standing in, not on a screen, not something I could replay or pause, just something that existed for a second and then disappeared, and I felt my focus shift completely, away from the camera, away from the explanations, toward the ceiling above the hallway, because for the first time, I was not trying to understand what had happened earlier, I was trying to understand what might still be happening right now. I stood there longer than I should have, staring up at the ceiling like I could somehow see through it if I focused hard enough, and the longer I stood still, the more aware I became of how quiet everything else was, like the house itself was holding its breath along with me, and I realized that I had stopped moving completely, one hand still resting near the wall where the light switch was, like I needed that small control in case something changed, and I told myself again that there were normal explanations for sounds like that. Houses settle, wood expands and contracts, temperature shifts can cause small movements you would never notice during the day, and I repeated that in my head more than once, trying to make it feel true instead of just logical, but it did not settle the feeling that something was off, because the sound I heard did not feel random, it felt placed, like it had a source that was choosing when to stop. I took a slow step forward, then another, moving closer to the attic hatch, and I noticed the floorboards under my feet creaked slightly, the same way they always did, familiar, predictable, and that should have been reassuring, but it also made me realize that any movement above me would probably make a sound too, and that thought stayed in the back of my mind as I stopped directly under the pull-down ladder, looking up at it, trying to remember the last time I had opened it, and it took me a second to even come up with an answer, which was part of the problem, because it meant I did not have a clear memory of its recent state, and that made it harder to say whether anything about it had changed. I reached up and touched the edge of the hatch, not opening it yet, just feeling it, like I had done with the front door earlier, looking for some kind of confirmation in something physical, and it felt normal, solid, closed, nothing loose, nothing out of place, and for a moment that helped. Because if it was still sealed properly, then whatever I heard could not have come from there, at least not easily, and I almost stepped back at that point, almost decided that I had checked enough, that I had gone further than necessary for something that was probably still just a misunderstanding, but then I heard it again, softer this time, but clearer because I was closer, a slight shift, like weight moving across something above me, followed by a pause that felt too deliberate to ignore. I froze again, this time without even thinking about it, my attention narrowing completely to the space above that hatch, and I realized I was listening for a pattern now, not just a single sound, something repeated, something consistent, and I stayed like that for several seconds, maybe longer, until the silence returned, steady and empty, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders building without release. Because there was nothing concrete to react to, just the possibility of something that I could not confirm. I told myself I needed more information, something visual, something I could point to and say this is real, this is happening, so I stepped back and pulled out my phone again, opening the camera app instead of the doorbell feed, and I angled it upward toward the attic hatch, as if that would somehow reveal something I could not see with my eyes alone, but the screen showed the same thing, just the flat surface of the ceiling and the outline of the hatch, nothing moving, nothing out of place. And I lowered the phone slightly, feeling a little ridiculous for even trying that, but at the same time not willing to dismiss the idea completely, because everything else had already started to feel unreliable. I thought about opening it, just pulling the ladder down and checking, ending the uncertainty in one clear action, but the idea did not feel as simple as it should have, because the moment I imagined it, I also imagined what it would mean if something was actually there, not in a dramatic way, not like something would jump out or anything like that, just the quiet realization that I had been right to question it, and that whatever was up there had been there long enough to move without being noticed, and that thought made my hand hesitate before even reaching for the latch. Instead, I stepped back again, putting a little distance between myself and the hatch, and I decided to check something else first, something that felt less direct but still useful, so I went back to the app and opened the indoor camera feed I had set up in the living room, a small device mounted near the bookshelf that I rarely thought about unless I was away from home, and I scrolled back through its timeline, looking for any gaps, any moments where it stopped recording or picked up something unusual, and at first everything looked normal, clips of me earlier that evening, moving around, turning lights on and off, nothing out of place, but when I reached the time around 2:13 in the morning, there was a gap, not a long one, just a few minutes where no footage was recorded at all, and I stared at that empty space on the timeline longer than I should have, because I knew the camera did not just stop like that, not without a reason, and there was no notification, no alert, nothing to explain why it had gone offline at that exact time. I felt that same tightening in my chest again, sharper this time, because now there was a second piece that did not fit, something that lined up too closely with the doorbell footage to ignore, and I replayed the surrounding clips again, looking for anything that might explain the gap, any flicker, any sign of interference, but there was nothing, just a clean break in the recording and then everything resumed as if nothing had happened. I lowered the phone slowly and looked back toward the hallway, toward the attic hatch, and I realized that whatever explanation I had been holding on to earlier was getting weaker with each detail, not stronger, and I could feel that shift happening in real time, the point where something stops being weird and starts feeling like a problem you cannot easily walk away from, and I stood there for another second, listening again, waiting to hear that same subtle movement above me, not because I wanted to confirm it, but because I needed to know whether it would happen again, whether it had a pattern, whether it was something I could predict, and in that moment, the silence felt heavier than any sound could have, because it meant whatever was up there, if anything was capable of staying completely still. I stayed where I was for a while, just standing in that hallway with my phone still in my hand, staring at the gap in the camera timeline like it might change if I looked at it long enough, and I kept trying to force everything back into something that made sense, something that followed a normal explanation, because that was still easier than accepting what it was starting to look like, and I told myself there had to be a connection I was missing, something simple that tied the doorbell footage and the camera outage together without turning it into something worse, so I went back through the timeline again, slower this time, checking not just the clips but the exact timestamps, comparing them, making sure I was not misreading anything, and the gap lined up almost perfectly with when the man appeared at the front door, which should not have meant anything on its own, but it did, Because it removed the idea that these were two separate issues, and instead made them feel like parts of the same event. I tried another angle, something more practical, thinking maybe it was a power fluctuation, something that caused one camera to miss a few minutes while the other still recorded, but the lights in the house had not flickered, the television had stayed on, nothing else had reset or behaved strangely, and that explanation fell apart almost immediately, and I found myself standing there again with nothing solid to hold on to, just a series of details that kept pointing in the same direction without ever fully confirming it. I realized then that I had been avoiding something obvious, something I had not checked yet because it required me to actually act on what I was thinking, not just analyze it, and that was the locks, not just the front door, but all of them, every entry point, every place someone could have gotten in or out, and I moved quickly this time, not rushing, but with more purpose than before, starting with the back door, checking the deadbolt, the handle, making sure everything was secure, and it was exactly how I left it, then the windows in the kitchen, each one closed, latched, nothing disturbed, and I moved through the house again, retracing my steps. But with a different focus now, not just looking for signs of someone inside, but signs that someone had passed through, and I did not find anything that confirmed that, but I did not find anything that fully ruled it out either, and that was the problem. The absence of evidence was not helping anymore, it was just making everything feel incomplete. When I got back to the hallway, I slowed down again, my attention pulling back toward the attic hatch, because even though I had checked everything else, that was still the one space I had not verified, and it stood out more now than it had before, not just because of the sound I thought I heard, but because it was the only place left that could explain the missing pieces without contradicting what I already knew, and I did not like that realization, because it meant I could not ignore it much longer. I looked up at it again, trying to approach it the same way I had approached everything else, methodically, without jumping to conclusions, and I told myself there were normal reasons for small noises above a ceiling, animals, airflow, even just structural shifts, and I held on to those possibilities as I reached up again, this time placing my hand firmly on the latch, feeling its shape, its position, confirming that it was exactly where it should be, and I noticed something then that I had not registered before. The latch was not as tight as I expected it to be, it was still closed, still holding the hatch in place, but there was a slight give to it, a looseness that did not feel like it had been there the last time I used it, and I paused again, my hand still resting on it, because that detail felt different from the others, less like something I might have forgotten and more like something that had changed. I pressed it lightly, just enough to test it, and it shifted a fraction of an inch before settling back, and I tried to remember if that was normal, if it always had that small amount of movement, and I could not be sure, and that uncertainty made it harder to dismiss, because it meant I could not rely on memory to correct it, and I stood there for a few seconds, weighing whether to open it or step back again, and I realized that either choice felt wrong in a different way. Opening it meant confirming something I was not ready to confirm, but walking away meant leaving a question unanswered that I was already thinking about too much. I took a step back instead, just one, creating a small amount of distance between myself and the hatch, and I told myself I needed one more piece of information before I did anything else, something that would either reinforce the idea that this was all coincidence or push it far enough that I could not ignore it anymore, and I thought about the doorbell footage again, about the man walking in, about the way the door opened, and I realized there was one thing I had not checked closely enough. His movement after he crossed the threshold, because I had been so focused on how he got in that I had not paid attention to what direction he took once he was inside. I opened the clip again and replayed it, this time letting it run a little longer, watching the last frames before it ended, and I noticed that after he stepped inside, his body shifted slightly to the left, not toward the living room where I had been sitting that night, but deeper into the house, toward the hallway, and as soon as I saw that, something in my mind connected in a way it had not before. Because that path lined up directly with where I was standing now, with where the attic hatch was located, and I felt that tightening in my chest again, sharper this time, because this was not just a possibility anymore, it was a direction, a movement that pointed somewhere specific, and I lowered the phone slowly, my eyes drifting back up to the ceiling, to that same spot above me, and for the first time since I started checking everything, I was not trying to explain it away anymore. I was trying to decide what to do about it. I did not move right away after that. I just stood there under the attic hatch with my phone still in my hand, replaying that last part of the clip in my head, the way he turned left instead of going toward the living room, the way his body angled toward the hallway like he already knew the layout, and that detail kept repeating itself, because it was not random, it was intentional, and the more I thought about it, the harder it became to convince myself that any of this was coincidence. I looked down at my phone again, then back up at the ceiling, and I realized I was waiting for something to happen, some kind of confirmation that would force me to act, because as long as nothing changed, I could still pretend this was all just a series of strange but explainable events, and that hesitation stretched longer than it should have, until I noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore once I saw it. The edge of the attic hatch was not sitting flush against the ceiling anymore, there was a thin line of shadow along one side that I was sure had not been there earlier, and I leaned slightly to the side to get a better angle, just to make sure it was not the lighting playing tricks on me, but the shadow stayed, consistent, like the hatch had shifted just enough to break the seal. I felt that same tightening in my chest again, but this time it did not fade, it held steady, because this was not something I could easily explain away, not like the sounds or the camera glitch, this was physical, visible, and it meant something had changed since the last time I looked at it. I stepped back another pace, giving myself more space, and I kept my eyes on that edge, watching it closely, and for a second nothing happened, everything stayed still, and I almost convinced myself it had always been like that I just had not noticed it before, but then I saw it move, just slightly, barely enough to register, a faint shift as if the weight above it had adjusted, and I froze completely. Every part of me focused on that one point, because there was no way to misinterpret that, no way to turn it into something harmless. I did not hear anything this time, no accompanying sound, just that small movement, and that made it worse, because it meant whatever was causing it could control how much noise it made, or whether it made any at all, and that thought settled in immediately, heavy and quiet, and I realized that whatever I had been trying to avoid thinking about was no longer something I could keep at a distance. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself without making any sudden movement, and I looked around the hallway again, not because I expected anything else to have changed, but because I needed to remind myself of where I was, what I could control, and I noticed how narrow the space felt now, how the walls seemed closer than they had a few minutes ago, and I shifted my weight slightly, trying to decide what the next step should be, because standing there was not helping anymore. I thought about calling someone, maybe the police, maybe a neighbor, but the idea felt premature in a way I could not fully explain, because I did not have anything concrete to report, just a series of observations that sounded less convincing the moment I imagined saying them out loud, and that hesitation kept me from reaching for my phone again, even though part of me knew that might have been the safer choice. Instead, I focused on something more immediate, something I could do without leaving the situation entirely, and I reached over to the hallway light switch and turned it off, then back on again, watching the ceiling as the light changed, as if the shift in brightness might reveal something new, and for a moment the shadow along the edge of the hatch seemed deeper, more defined, and I stared at it, trying to see if it would move again, but it stayed still this time, perfectly still, like whatever had caused the earlier movement had stopped completely. I realized then that I was being watched in a way that was different from anything I had considered before, not in the obvious sense, not like someone standing in front of me, but from somewhere I could not see directly, somewhere above me, and that realization did not come all at once, it built slowly, piece by piece, until it settled into something I could not ignore, and I felt my attention shift completely away from the idea of checking the hatch and toward the idea of getting out of that hallway. I took another step back, then another, moving slowly but deliberately, keeping my eyes on the ceiling the entire time, not wanting to lose track of that edge, that small gap that had not been there before, and I could feel my breathing change, becoming more controlled, more intentional, because I did not want to make noise, did not want to draw attention to myself in a way that might cause another movement, and I kept moving until I reached the entrance to the living room, where the space opened up slightly and I could put more distance between myself and the attic. I stopped there and turned slightly, just enough to keep the hallway in view while also giving myself access to the front door, and I realized that the layout of the house suddenly mattered in a way it never had before, the paths, the distances, the time it would take to move from one place to another, and I started calculating those things without even meaning to, because now I was not just thinking about what had already happened. I was thinking about what could happen next, and how quickly I could respond to it. I glanced down at my phone again, then back toward the hallway, and I noticed something else, something that made everything feel sharper, more immediate. The indoor camera feed I had left open was still showing that same gap in the timeline, but now it felt different, not like a past event I was analyzing, but like a missing piece that might still be happening, and I realized that I did not know if that camera was recording right now. I had just assumed it had resumed normally, but I had not actually confirmed it, and that thought pushed me to check it again, quickly, tapping into the live view, and for a second the screen stayed black, just a loading icon spinning, before the image finally appeared, showing the empty living room exactly as it should be, but the delay, even that small delay, was enough to make me question how much I could rely on it, and I looked up again, back toward the hallway, toward the attic hatch that was no longer fully sealed, and I understood something. Then that I had been avoiding since the beginning, whatever I saw on that camera, whatever the footage showed or did not show, it was not the full picture, and it never had been. I stayed at the edge of the living room, not fully stepping into it, not fully turning away from the hallway either, like I was trying to hold both spaces in view at the same time, and I realized that I was no longer thinking about checking anything else in the house, not the doors, not the windows, not the cameras, because none of that felt like it would change what I had already seen, and what I had already heard, and the only thing that mattered now was distance, how far I was from that hatch, how quickly I could move if I needed to, and how much of the house I could see at once without putting myself in a position where I could not react. I kept my phone in my hand, not even looking at the screen anymore, just holding it like it was part of what kept me grounded, and I shifted my weight slowly, testing how quiet I could move, placing my foot down carefully on the hardwood, listening for any sound it might make, and then I froze again, because the moment I moved, I heard something above me respond, not loud, not sudden, just a faint adjustment that matched the timing of my step too closely to ignore, and I stopped completely, my attention snapping back to the ceiling, to that same section above the hallway, and this time there was no question about it, the sound was connected to me, not random, not structural, but reactive. I did not move again after that, not for several seconds, maybe longer, and the silence that followed felt different now, not empty, but waiting, like whatever was up there had also stopped, listening the same way I was, and that realization changed something in how I was thinking, because it meant I was not just dealing with a presence, I was dealing with something aware enough to respond, aware enough to stay still when I stayed still, and that made every small decision feel heavier, more deliberate. I slowly lowered my foot back to a neutral position, careful not to shift too quickly, and I kept my eyes on the hallway, on the ceiling line where the hatch was, even though I could not see it directly from where I was standing now, and I felt a pressure building in my chest that was not panic exactly, but something close to it, something controlled but tight, and I knew I could not stay there indefinitely. I had to either move further away or do something to change the situation, because standing still was not going to resolve anything. I thought about the front door, how close it was, how quickly I could reach it if I moved now, and that option felt more real than anything else, because it did not depend on understanding what was happening, it only depended on getting out of the space where it was happening, and I shifted my body slightly in that direction, just enough to test how much movement I could make without triggering another response. And for a second nothing happened, no sound, no shift above me, and that small absence of reaction gave me just enough confidence to take another step, then another, each one slow, controlled, measured, and I kept my breathing steady, not shallow, not rushed, just enough to avoid drawing attention to myself through any sudden change. I reached the front door and placed my hand on the deadbolt, feeling it again, the same way I had earlier, but this time it did not feel like confirmation, it felt like an exit, and I started to turn it slowly, carefully, trying to minimize the sound of the mechanism, and as it clicked, softly but still audible in the quiet house, I heard another movement above me, slightly sharper this time, like something shifting more quickly than before, and I froze with my hand still on the lock, not fully opening it yet, because the timing was too exact to ignore, and I realized that whatever was up there was not just reacting to movement in general, it was reacting to specific actions, specific changes in the environment, and that made everything feel more immediate, more urgent, because it meant I was not just being observed, I was being tracked in a way that followed my intent. I did not finish opening the door right away. I just stood there with the lock turned, listening, waiting to see if there would be another sound, another shift, but the silence returned again, controlled, deliberate, and that pattern was starting to feel consistent, movement followed by stillness, reaction followed by waiting, and I understood then that whatever I did next would likely trigger another response, and I had to decide whether that response would happen while I was still inside or while I was already outside. I tightened my grip on the handle slightly, then loosened it again, testing the motion, making sure I could open it in one smooth movement without hesitation, and I took one slow breath before turning the handle the rest of the way and pulling the door open just enough to create a gap, not wide, just enough to step through, and the moment the door moved, I heard it again, louder this time, a clear shift above the hallway, followed by something that sounded almost like a step, and that was enough. I did not wait to confirm anything else. I moved through the doorway immediately, stepping onto the porch and pulling the door closed behind me in the same motion, not slamming it, just firm, controlled, and I leaned back against it for a second, listening from the outside now, the difference in perspective making everything feel slightly unreal, because the house looked exactly the same from out there, quiet, still, no signs of anything wrong, and I stood there for a moment longer, my hand still on the handle, realizing that I had left without actually seeing what was inside, without confirming anything directly, and yet somehow knowing that staying would not have given me a clearer answer, only a closer one. I stayed on the porch longer than I expected to, my back still against the door, my hand resting on the handle like I was making sure it would not open on its own, and I kept listening, not just for something obvious, but for anything at all, any shift, any movement from the other side that might confirm what I had just felt inside. But the house stayed quiet, completely still, and that made it harder to process what had just happened, because from the outside everything looked normal, the porch light casting the same soft glow across the driveway, the street beyond empty and quiet, no movement, no sound, nothing that matched what I had just experienced a few feet away. I stepped forward slowly, away from the door, creating a small gap between myself and the house, and I turned slightly to look at the windows, especially the ones facing the living room and the hallway, trying to see if there was any sign of movement inside, any shadow, any shift in the light, but everything looked unchanged, the curtains still, the interior dim, no silhouettes, no indication that anything was moving behind them, and I realized that from this angle, from this distance, the house gave nothing away. I reached for my phone again, this time not to replay the footage, but to call someone, because standing out there alone did not feel like enough anymore, and I scrolled through my contacts quickly before stopping, not because I did not know who to call, but because I was trying to decide how to explain what I was about to say, how to turn everything that had just happened into something that sounded real and immediate instead of uncertain and incomplete, and that hesitation lasted just long enough for me to glance back at the front door again, and that was when I noticed something I had not seen before. The door was not fully closed. It was subtle, barely noticeable, just a thin line of darkness along the frame where it should have been sealed shut, and I stared at it for a second, trying to understand how that was possible, because I remembered pulling it closed behind me, not forcefully, but firmly enough that it should have latched, and I took a small step closer, my focus narrowing on that gap, and I realized I had not heard the latch click when I stepped outside. I had been too focused on the sound above me, too focused on getting out, and now that detail was coming back in a way that made my chest tighten again. I did not reach for the handle right away, I just stood there, watching that thin line, waiting to see if it would change on its own, and for a moment it did not, it stayed exactly the same, just slightly open, just enough to suggest that it had not fully closed, and I told myself that was all it was, that I had simply not shut it properly, that everything else was making me read into it more than I should. And I almost accepted that, almost stepped forward to fix it, but then it moved, just a fraction, barely an inch, but enough to widen the gap slightly, and I froze again, my eyes locked on that movement, because it was not caused by me, not by wind, not by anything I could see. I did not hear footsteps this time, I did not hear anything at all, just that slow, controlled shift of the door moving inward, and that was enough to confirm something I had been trying not to fully accept, that whatever had been inside had not stayed where it was, it had moved, and it was now closer to the entrance than before. I took a step back immediately, increasing the distance between myself and the door, and I felt my grip tighten around my phone as I finally made the decision I had been hesitating on. I started dialing, not even looking at the screen to double-check the number, just selecting the first option that made sense, because at that point I was no longer trying to figure it out on my own. I just needed someone else involved. Someone who could respond to something I could not fully control. As the call connected, I kept my eyes on the door, watching that narrow opening, waiting to see if it would move again, and for a few seconds it did not. It stayed exactly where it was, slightly ajar, completely still, and that stillness felt more deliberate than anything else, like whatever was behind it had chosen to stop right there, just out of view. And I realized that the distance between me and the door was now the only thing separating me from whatever was inside. I spoke into the phone, keeping my voice as steady as I could, explaining my address first, then trying to summarize what had happened without overcomplicating it. But even as I said the words, I could hear how incomplete they sounded, how they left out the part that mattered most, because I could not fully describe what I had not seen directly, only what I had inferred from everything else. And that made it feel less certain even though it felt more real than anything else I had experienced. That night, I stayed on the line, listening to the operator, answering questions when I could, but my focus never left that door, and I noticed something else then, something that had not been there before. The porch light flickered slightly, just once, not enough to go out completely, just enough to dim and return, and I glanced up at it for a second before looking back at the door, and that was when I realized that the camera mounted next to it was angled slightly differently than before, not by much, just enough that the edge of the frame no longer aligned with the corner of the porch the way it had earlier, and that detail hit me in a way the others had not, because it meant something had interacted with it directly, something had been close enough to adjust it. And that meant whatever was inside was not just staying hidden, it was moving through the space, using it, changing it in small ways that only became obvious when you looked closely enough. I stepped back again, putting more distance between myself and the house, and I kept watching that door, that narrow opening that had widened just enough to confirm that it was not sealed, and I understood then that leaving the house had not ended anything, it had only changed my position in relation to it, and whatever was inside was still there, still aware, and possibly closer to the exit than it had been before. I stayed on the line as I kept watching the door, and at some point I realized I had stopped blinking as much, like I was afraid I might miss something if I looked away even for a second, and the operator was still talking, asking me to stay where I was, asking if I felt safe, and I answered automatically, yes, I am outside, yes, I am away from the house, but the truth was I did not feel safe at all. Because whatever was inside had already shown that it could move without making much noise, and now it was close enough to the front door that the distance between us felt smaller than it should have been. The door did not move again right away, it just stayed slightly open, the gap dark and narrow, and I kept expecting it to widen suddenly or for something to appear in that space, but nothing did, and that waiting felt worse than if something had happened immediately, because it stretched the moment out, made every second feel longer than it actually was, and I found myself shifting my weight slightly just to break that stillness, even though I knew that any movement from me might cause a reaction from inside. I glanced down at my phone briefly, not to check anything specific, just to ground myself in something familiar. And I saw that the doorbell camera was still active, still recording, and without thinking too much about it, I opened the live feed, holding the phone up so I could see the front door from the camera's angle instead of just my own, and that change in perspective felt strange immediately, because on the screen, the door looked more closed than it did in front of me, the gap was still there, but it was less obvious, almost hidden by the angle, and I realized that if I had only been watching through the camera, I might not have noticed it at all. I kept watching both views at the same time, the real door in front of me and the version of it on the screen, and for a moment everything lined up, both still, both unchanged, and then I saw something on the phone that I did not see with my own eyes, a slight shift in the shadow inside the doorway, not the door itself moving, but something just beyond it, deeper in the frame, and I immediately looked up from the screen to the actual door, trying to match what I had just seen, but from where I was standing, the interior was too dark, too obscured by the angle, and I could not confirm it directly. I lowered the phone slightly and then raised it again, focusing on the screen this time, because that was the only place I could see clearly into that space, and the shadow did not move again right away. It stayed in the same position, just inside the doorway, like something had stopped just out of sight, and I felt that same tightening in my chest return, sharper now, because this was no longer just about sounds or small movements. This was something I could almost see, something that was close enough to the entrance to be captured by the camera but not fully revealed. I took another step back without realizing it, increasing the distance between myself and the house, and I kept my eyes on the screen, not wanting to lose that angle, because it was giving me information I could not get any other way, and the operator's voice was still there, asking if I could describe what I was seeing, and I tried to answer, but my words felt slower than my thoughts, like I was describing something that was already changing while I spoke. The shadow shifted again, slightly to the side this time, and I noticed something about its movement that made everything feel worse. It was not random, not drifting like a change in lighting, it had direction, intention, and it stayed just within the boundary of what the camera could not fully capture, never crossing into a clear shape, never resolving into something I could identify, and that pattern made it feel controlled, like whatever was inside understood where the camera was and how far it could move without being fully seen. I felt my grip tighten around the phone again, and I realized I was leaning slightly forward without meaning to, trying to get a better view of the screen, even though I knew I should be doing the opposite. I should be stepping further away, creating more distance, but that need to understand what I was looking at kept pulling me closer, at least mentally, and I had to force myself to take another step back, then another, until I was near the edge of the driveway. The door still had not opened further, it had not closed either, it just remained in that same partially open position, and I started to understand that this was not about the door itself anymore, it was about what was choosing to stay behind it, just out of sight, and that realization settled in quietly but firmly, because it meant the situation had not ended when I stepped outside, it had simply shifted into something else, something where the distance between us was measured in inches of space rather than walls or rooms. I heard the faint sound of a car in the distance then, approaching slowly along the street, and I knew that had to be the response I had called for, and that sound should have brought relief, but it did not immediately, because my focus was still locked on the door, on the screen, on that shadow that had not fully revealed itself, and I found myself watching to see if it would react to the approaching vehicle the same way it had reacted to my movement earlier, if it would shift, retreat, or disappear entirely. And for a few seconds it did nothing, it stayed exactly where it was, just inside the threshold, and then, as the headlights from the approaching car began to sweep across the front of the house, I saw it move again on the screen, not toward the door, but away from it, deeper into the darkness inside, and it vanished from the frame in a way that felt intentional, like it had chosen the moment to step back, just before there would be enough light to expose it. I lowered the phone slowly after that, my eyes moving from the screen back to the actual door, which still looked the same from where I stood, slightly open, silent, giving nothing away, and I realized that whatever had been inside was no longer near the entrance, it had retreated, not because I had left, but because something else was arriving, and that made the situation feel different again, not over, not resolved, just shifted into another stage where I was no longer the only one involved. But still the only one who had seen enough to know how wrong it actually was.